So it's HMS Furious Part 1, a seaplane carrier during World War I. So HMS Furious played a seminal role in the development of British carrier aviation, transitioning through multiple reconstructions in a long frontline career from 1917 to 1944. Furious was the last of a group of 3 large light cruisers ordered in April 1915 to meet requirements put forward by Lord Fisher for a very fast, lightly protected, heavily armed large cruisers with shallow draft potentially as components of a force to support his so-called Baltic project for landing troops on Germany's Baltic coast. The final design produced vessels capable of 32 knots that could maintain high speed in quite heavy weather due to their sheer size. They displaced 4 times as much as contemporary Royal Navy light cruisers. Protection was on the same scale as other light cruisers: 3-inch side armor, 1-inch deck protection, except over the magazines where it increased to 3 inches, but they had 7-inch protection for the barbettes of their heavy guns and relatively shallow bulges. The first 2 ships, Courageous and Glorious, were armed with 2 15-inch turrets, 1 forward and 1 aft, and 6 triple 4-inch mountings, similar to those carried on the earlier Repulse-class battlecruisers. This latter mounting was one of the worst ever designed for the Royal Navy. It was clumsy, manually operated, required a large crew of 32 men, and the gun barrels were so close together that the operators constantly got in each other's way, completely negating the high volume of fire the designers envisaged. Furious, as ordered, differed from the earlier cruisers in 3 ways. Instead of the 15-inch guns, it had 2 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a British warship, in single turrets fore and aft. The unsatisfactory 4-inch weapons were replaced with 11 single 5.5-inch guns, the same as those later fitted to the battlecruiser Hood, and the beam was increased from 81 feet to 88 feet. This latter change has bedeviled model makers, who usually have assumed that the hull was wider than that of the earlier ships, whereas the increase in beam was solely manifested in deeper bulges. The hulls above the waterline were identical for all 3 cruisers. Well before Furious's completion, the gunnery cabal, the most influential group in the Royal Navy, raised serious doubts about the efficacy of the ship's main armament. Effective gunnery in action required salvo fire. The 18-inch guns had a rate of fire of 1 round every 60 seconds, whereas the 15-inch guns of the other 2 large light cruisers could fire a round every 30 to 32 seconds. Since they had twin turrets, salvo fire could be effective even in a chase situation. With single turrets, Furious could only deploy salvo fire when engaged on the broadside, and the slow rate of fire made this marginally effective. These concerns led to a major reconsideration of Furious's potential role. By mid-1916, experience convinced the Admiralty of the potential value of aircraft operating at sea, both for reconnaissance and for defense against German Zeppelins. This was manifest in the conversion of 3 speedy cross-channel and Isle of Man packet ships into seaplane carriers for service in home waters, and the in-process modification of 2 further incomplete hulls. The Royal Navy had also purchased the much larger Cunard liner Campania and undertaken a significant conversion to make it into an effective seaplane carrier. The packet ships were quite small, around 3,000 to 3,500 tons, and could carry half a dozen or so aircraft. Campania displaced 18,000 tons, but the aircraft capacity was similar. All these ships were capable of 21 to 24 knots, but other than Campania, which was becoming rather worn out, were much slower in rougher weather. This was a significant limitation on their effectiveness, since the speed essentially was the same as that of the Grand Fleet. Whenever the carriers had to diverge from the line of advance in order to launch aircraft or stop for their recovery, it was difficult for them to quickly rejoin and reform with the fleet. Furious's large size and speed advantage over that of the Grand Fleet made conversion into a fast seaplane carrier capable of operating effectively with the fleet in all weathers a very attractive proposition. The forward 18-inch turret and its barbette armor above the forecastle deck were removed and replaced with a large hangar for 8 to 10 aircraft. A sloping flying-off deck, 228 feet long, ran from the hangar to the stem. 2 derrick-type cranes lifted aircraft from the hangar to its roof through a long, narrow hatch. A track ran longitudinally the length of the flying-off deck to guide a 4-wheel trolley that allowed float planes to take off. Obviously, wheeled land planes did not require this equipment. Furious commissioned as a large light cruiser on the 26th of June 1917 and joined its sisters in the 1st Cruiser Squadron, engaged in patrols in the North Sea. Furious, escorted by 4 destroyers from the 13th Flotilla, was assigned to the failed patrol line intended to intercept the German light cruisers Bremse and Brummer during the active action off Lerwick on the 17th to the 18th of October, but otherwise saw little combat action. More significant work was exploring the boundaries of aircraft operation, for which Furious's size and speed were most useful. The ship's senior aviation officer, Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning, on the 2nd of August 1917, successfully landed his Sopwith pup on the flying-off deck after passing by the superstructure and side-slipping onto the deck, relying also on members of the crew seizing hold of toggles on the machine to assist it in holding it down. He made another landing on the 7th of August, but when he attempted to repeat his success later the day, his engine failed, the pup went over the side, and Dunning was knocked out in his cockpit and drowned. His successor, Squadron Commander Frederick Rutland, nicknamed Rutland of Jutland in the popular newspapers for his reconnaissance work with a short 184 seaplane during the battle, continued these experiments, but quickly stopped them, reporting to the Admiralty that a pilot conducting such operations would have a life expectancy of 10 landings. Thereafter, Furious operated solely as a launching platform until the ship was returned to Armstrong's Walker Yard in November 1917 for extensive modifications to make the ship more suitable for aircraft operations, the story I will tell in my next presentation on HMS Furious. The basis for this 1 to 700 scale model of Furious, as initially commissioned, is a very rare resin and 3D printed kit from the obscure Japanese manufacturer Flotilla Models. This firm is so obscure that its existence has not registered on scalemates, but I have ascertained that it produced only 2 kits, both of HMS Furious, one of the ship as originally designed and the other as commissioned. I have only seen 1 or 2 photographs of the second kit, which is rather clunky, but I did manage to find an example of the original kit, so my model actually follows the process through which the original ship went. The kit is very much a what-if, you can see from the drawing there, with 2 18-inch gun turrets and a full complement of anti-torpedo net booms, and a molded-in furled net along the sheer. Fortunately, the manufacturers did not fall for increasing the beam above the waterline, unlike Loose Cannon did with its kit for Furious in its next guise. Overall, the main resin components are crisply rendered, as are the various 3D printed detail parts, although these come with very heavy rafts, and surprisingly, several were severely warped. Whatever material flotilla models used for printing these proved utterly impervious to anything I tried to do to remove the warps, so I ended up replacing them with scratch-built parts. I could not find as-fitted drawings for Furious in the Royal Museum's Greenwich online catalogue, although I strongly suspect that they must exist. I also received no response to several email inquiries about them. Instead, I had to rely on the large drawings in R.A. Burt's British battleships of World War I, but these are not wholly reliable, as cross-checking with photographs demonstrated. The modification process broke down into 3 sections. Modifying the hull. It was very simple to consign the forward gun turret and the anti-torpedo net booms to the spares box. I used a very sharp, small chisel to remove the molded-on torpedo net itself and to cut away the breakwater ahead of the forward barbette. I did not bother to eliminate the forward barbette, since it would have vanished inside the new hangar. I then drilled out all the hull portholes. I added material to increase the height of the aftermost section of the superstructure on the right. I also added photo-etched brass ensign white watertight doors and hatches and drilled out all the superstructure portholes. Finally, I made a trapezoidal box to extend the forward superstructure to meet the hangar rear wall. One oddity I uncovered is that whilst the anti-torpedo net booms were never fitted to Furious, the ship initially retained the net shelves along the sheer. These were not platforms, but frameworks, and show up as shadows on the hull sides in photographs. Mine, which you can see here, are from cut-down photo-etched 2-bar railing material. Next was making the hangar and flying off deck. The basic structure was assembled from various thicknesses of plastic sheet. The etched brass girders supporting the deck came from loose cannon. Many years ago, I had asked David Angelo if he could let me have a set of photo etch from his kit for Furious in its first aircraft carrier guide, and he kindly provided it. The slightly raised hatch was from 1/4 mm sheet bent to form a pitched roof. You may have seen that it had a pitched roof in that photograph of the hatch earlier on. The windbreaks were made from 1/2 mm plastic rod. They really were round. They're not flat, as photographs showed. I stuck pieces of the correct length tightly together onto masking tape, removed every alternate rod, and used the tape to hold them down in place while I glued them. Next came modifying the superstructure, the forward superstructure. The lowest level required quite a few changes from the condition as originally designed. The forward part was shortened to abut the rear wall of the hangar, whilst the after section had to be lengthened to reach as far back as the funnel. This extension needed sponsons added for 2 36-inch searchlights and a pair of 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. It is not clear from photographs if this deck level was surrounded by railings with canvas dodgers or solid bulwarks. I decided to add solid bulwarks from paper hardened with cyano. The next 2 levels needed some work, driven mainly by the need to match the work I had done below in fitting very thin bulwarks. The printed bulwarks of the platform were much too thick. This was when I discovered 2 more interesting characteristics of the 3D printed material. It was both very hard and very brittle, and it seemed to be virtually impervious to any adhesive in my inventory. Eventually, I had to resort to to press fitting 2 sections together, completely replacing the platform with a scratch-built item from sheet plastic, and relying on the new brass mast I installed to replace the warped 3D printed item to hold the whole thing together. This upper platform also supported an additional searchlight tower, which was simply made from brass tube and plastic sheet. At this point, I completed the tripod mast, all brass rods soldered together. I then added the platform there, which carried the director. It was another 3D printed item. It needed to have a surround of splinter matting, for which I used photo etched brass from White Ensign that I shaped to match and soldered together so that it was a press fit. I also made sure that the hole for the mast was as tight as possible so I could avoid using an adhesive. The spotting top at the masthead was another 3D printed piece, so I replaced it by scratch building a completely new one. This also allowed me to incorporate see-through windows from etched brass ladder stock. The short topmast and yards were made from brass rod and replaced yet more 3D printed pieces. Next came modifying the after superstructure. I added material to increase the height of the after section of the superstructure, which you can see on the right. The mast, yards, and derrick boom, again, were all brass rod soldered together. The originals were warped beyond recovery. The enlarged searchlight platform was a mixture of the kit's 3D printed parts and sheet plastic. The brass tripod components again hold everything together because glue doesn't work. This is where I've reached. It's held together by force of habit. They're just lying there loose. They will all be dismantled because it's much easier to paint. I'm using 5.5-inch guns, 36-inch searchlights, Carly rafts, and boats from Micromaster in New Zealand, and the 3-inch guns are by Nico from Poland. I will be using generic White Ensign photo etch for the railings and fine copper wire for rigging. Once I've completed this model, I move on to building Furious as an aircraft carrier with the aft landing on deck. My model for this is based on a kit for Glorious to avoid dealing with the problems of the excessive beam of the loose cannon kit that throws off quite a few of the dimensions of the superstructure, as Jim Bowman discovered with his build of this kit. My construction has already started, even though I've yet to finish this first model, since the forward flying off deck structure of the two versions of Furious are very similar. And that's it.